Okay, Dan.
Sure. Like I said, they put together just a handful of slides for a brief update. We're not in a position to make recommendations right now, but wanted to give you an idea of what we've been up to and what the next steps are as we continue on this engagement and prepare for a final report in the August timeframe. So if you want to go to the next slide, do I control this or you control this, Micah?
I got it, Dan.
All right, thanks.
Let me know next slide and I'll shift down.
Great. Well, in the last couple of months, we began our engagement with financial conditions assessment and trends analysis. As we described to you when we met with the supervisors back in January, I believe it was, we start with a baseline financial forecast, and we developed that forecast based on current trends. Rather than looking at a single year of general fund and operating activity, we take a look 5 years back to 2015 and see how revenues and expenses are moving. That enables us to identify the factors that have led to the current situation and do a projection going forward. Of course, almost immediately after we were engaged, the COVID crisis broke out, which kind of turns projections upside down. The 5-year look back did not all of a sudden become irrelevant, certainly not, but it seemed a little bit backwards to think about 5 years down the road without looking even 5 months down the road. So we shifted gears a little bit. It's not our typical approach to these engagements, but we thought for the township that the most useful thing we could do is try to help with a near-term cash projection. So we've provided a couple different versions of monthly cash projections between now and the end of the year. Also part of this engagement is a review of the township's operations. And we've been reviewing financial information related to each department, met with department heads, met with union leaders, met with almost all the supervisors, and we want to keep those communication lines open. So we're taking as much information as we can into this process. You want to move on? So a quick slide on historical revenues and expenses. These are expenditures and revenues. Expenditures including transfers that almost entirely are comprised of transfers for capital needs. You can see since 2015, there's only been 1 year where revenues have exceeded the combined expenditures and transfers. Relatively flat revenue growth over that time, and actually operating revenues operating expenditures have been relatively stable as well. It's not like we've seen super above inflation growth in expenses, but it's been the increases in transfers to the capital fund actually that has put the most pressure on this sort of situation. The general fund, as everybody's aware, is heavily reliant on the earned income tax, and there's no real estate tax millage that supports the general fund. There's, of course, a combined 4.5 mils that supports several other funds. And on the operating cost side, the last bullet, the workforce has received steady pay increases and health benefit costs continue to grow, and that's kind of baked into almost every single municipal budget. Expenditures comprise, I think, 82%, just adding up of total general fund costs. So that's the primary cost driver. But again, those aren't necessarily out of control. It's just we have a revenue situation that's not keeping pace with expenditures and capital needs. The mismatch between revenues and expenses has put pressure on fund balance. Looking back to 2015, the township was in a very strong fund balance position, between 25 and 30% of fund balance equaled between 25 and 30% of operating revenues. But it's been declining over time, and the budget this year was just about enough to meet the township's fund balance policy, which is a minimum of 8%. The GFOA, and there are other benchmarks out there that we can point to, generally recommends 2 months of operating expenses as a fund balance position. And the fund balance and having a weaker fund balance has put the township in kind of a weaker spot to deal with COVID-related impacts this year. We can move on to the cash projection in a minute, but it's with a stronger fund balance, maybe you'd be facing tougher decisions, or maybe sleeping a little bit better at night about what may or may not come in the next few months. You can move on, Mike. All right, now this was the cash projection I know the supervisors had the chance to look at, and I think we touched on briefly with almost all of our meeting when we were able to meet with you all. This was a projection done in May 8th, and my colleague Alex Sullivan is on with me too. We were debating about even doing another projection before this meeting, but we said, hey, let's, we've already given the supervisors 2 sets of numbers. Let's walk through this schedule. But I think one of the points here is this is a very unique time, once in a century pandemic. No municipality in the country has had to deal with something like this and forecast out what might happen. So things are changing on a week to week, even day-to-day basis sometimes. So everything needs to be refined and looked at as we go. As we set this up with first establishing a baseline of cash receipts and expenditures. And the baseline is based on your 2020 budget with first 2 or 3, I think through March year-to-date actual numbers. So we took the budget and we had the treasurer's reports and we're able to incorporate that into annual revenues. Baseline expenses were based on the same. You budgeted the use of fund balance to cover the difference between revenues and expenses, and that's where we ended up. Rolling in the COVID-related impacts, again, 60% of your general fund relying on EIT makes you more sensitive to those fluctuations than other municipalities. Based on not just economic-related changes or reduced activity in the near term, reduced to business closures, people not going to work, but also timing-related changes. We've learned more about the timing of when EIT your earned income taxes are collected over time, over the last month or two than we thought we'd ever know. Our baseline projection projected out 11% reduction between now and the end of the year. And that's based on unemployment claims that have come through. It also assumes a little bit of a recovery in the second half of the year. We also assume an 8% reduction in other cash receipts. So moving down that middle column there, you see on a gross dollar basis, it projects out a reduction in EIT of almost $750,000 and other cash receipts of about $567,000. And that would put you in a very tight year-end cash position. And we've been in touch with Micah throughout this process, and he has relayed some of the corrective actions that have been put in place and some that could be considered if things do turn out to be as bad or worse than expected. So that third column incorporates about $760,000 of quote unquote corrective action, which would improve your bottom line year-end cash position. Not to caveat too much, but again, it needs to be revisited on a regular basis as the economy reopens and we are able to digest the actual impacts of the COVID crisis. before we move on, well, yeah, we got some of, it's okay. We could go on to that slide, Mike, because I think in the original package that we sent to that the supervisors saw, that didn't have all of our assumptions. But it assumes, first of all, we did this on a monthly basis too. What you saw in that summary slide was just the year-end impact. But since the township relies so heavily on EIT, and EIT can go up, there are 4 big collection months. It's not like a township or a municipality that relies heavily on real estate taxes, where you get a big chunk in March and April, and that carries you through to the rest of the year. We wanted to examine to make sure that, because of the nature of the timing of the cash flows, you weren't going to hit an unexpected cash shortfall in, say, September or October. And we didn't see that. The low point in the collection was going to be at the end of December, so we just showed the year end there. But our cash projection did take into account some delays in collections between April and July, and the extended deadlines for Q1 filings, and decreased tax generating activity for 2020 and into 2021. And another point I want to make sure we make during this presentation is, when you approach the 2021 budget, even if we had a full recovery, even if on January 1st we magically go back to a 2019 economy and employment level, you will still see 2021 budget impacts because of individuals filing their EIT reports based on their 2020 wages. So there will be a negative EIT impact in 2021 as well. I'm happy to address any questions you might have. This is a projection that we can help update as we move on in this process. Since there's a lot of information there, I just wanted to make sure that everybody had the chance to ask about it.
Are we finished with the presentation and the slides, or?
I think we had one last slide that discussed next steps.
Okay.
We're continuing with the operations review, what remaining interviews we have. We're going to develop our multi-year financial projections baseline. That's going to assume that some level of recovery and maintaining the existing level of township services. What's the cost to run the township as is? And then the revenue side right now is a little bit trickier, but the expenses will be based on a baseline of existing level of services. We have drafted, we'll share a citizen survey to collect feedback on what the citizens prioritize as their service levels and what they think the quality of the service levels are. And we're going to conduct a public meeting to solicit input and within the next few weeks. Our timing is, right now we're looking at August timeframe to deliver a final report, and we can deliver publicly the highlight, 3 or 4 big findings and recommendations of that report at a public meeting in August.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Questions for Dan?
I have a question. If you can delve a little bit more deeply into the EIT, which is so very important. We were talking at the Finance Committee yesterday about this impact, especially how local businesses and non-resident EIT, the impact of that on the revenue side. I'm not quite sure, if we got a clear idea, for example, how important local businesses are to the 11% reduction that you mentioned in EIT. Can you explain that? Maybe put some more numbers with regard to local economy?
Sure. Mike, are you able to unmute my colleague, Alex Sullivan, too, who's she can add in here as well. First of all, as a whole, the township has seen an overall decline in non-resident EIT over the last 5 years. In the 2015, 2016, 17 timeframe, this is probably attributed to Lockheed, but even since then, it hasn't returned to those levels. The township has a high concentration of restaurants and service industry type businesses, which would have a lot of non-resident employees there. Now, those non-residents, if their home municipality has an EIT, their home municipality always received it. So the township is impacted to the extent on just a general fund revenue perspective, to the extent that most of those, those employees or those workers live in a municipality that doesn't have an EIT. So
I guess if you assume that is the best case scenario, is the impact of those employees being out of work for however months it has been, is that represent a large portion of what we might expect as a decrease in EIT for the year?
I think most of the decrease is with residents of Newtown itself, and the numbers that we base most of the analysis on is based on unemployment claims in the local zip code. Because even if you have a Newtown resident that works out of Newtown, that Newtown resident is generating EIT income for the township.
Right, so you're saying that there is quite a substantial number of people, residents of Newtown itself, that are unemployed.
But it's Newtown isn't doing as bad as some places, but most of the negative implications for the EIT revenues will be from the Newtown residents themselves.
Okay. One other question. What about, I'm just curious about the other cash receipts, which you had an 8% reduction. I'm just wondering about the real estate transfer tax, which mostly has to do, I guess, with new home sales and with the new developments coming in, land sales that have been delayed, for example. Are those included in your other cash receipts?
Yes. And I can pull up the real estate transfer taxes. Alex, do you have the exact reduction of that piece? Most of that reduction is attributed to the recreational services and those revenues, anticipating that those programs would not be going forward. There's some revenues on that side that, COVID or not, you're going to get. State pension aid, you're going to get that. We hope, right? Pilot revenues, we didn't say that was COVID impacted. The primary component of that piece was the recreation type revenues, and frankly, the first reaction to dealing with that would be recreation services as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
I just want, since we're talking about EIT and the reliance there, we talked about non-resident going down. As more municipalities implement their own resident EIT, that's only going to put more pressure on that for the township.